You think death is the end? How adorably naive. Tonight, while you're comfortable in your ignorance, scrolling through your phone, I'm going to show you what really happened in Victorian England, when death was just the beginning of the nightmare. And when I'm done, you'll never hear a heartbeat monitor flatline the same way again. Picture this: London, 1850. The fog isn't just pollution, it's the breath of the living dead clawing their way back from premature graves. You see, my friend, the Victorians had a little problem. They couldn't tell the difference between unconscious and dead. And that mistake, it buried thousands alive. Let me paint you a scene that would make Edgar Allan Poe weep. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a respectable baker's wife, collapses during Sunday service. The doctor, and I use that term loosely, presses his ear to her chest. Nothing. Cold skin, no pulse, pupils fixed. Dead as a doornail, he declares. Within hours, she's sewn into her shroud, nailed into her coffin, and dropped 6 feet under in Highgate Cemetery. But here's where it gets delicious. 3 days later, the groundskeeper hears something that makes his blood freeze. Scratching, muffled screaming, coming from underground. By the time they dig her up, Eleanor's fingernails are gone, torn away trying to claw through solid wood. Her throat is shredded from screaming. Her beautiful face, well, let's just say terror leaves its mark. This wasn't rare. This was Tuesday in Victorian England. The London Medical Society estimated that 1 in every 25 burials was premature. Do the math. In a city of 4 million, that's 160,000 people buried alive. Not dead, buried alive. The medical establishment knew. Oh, they knew. Dr. Franz Hartmann documented over 700 cases of premature burial in his 1896 study. But here's the conspiracy that'll make your skin crawl. They covered it up. Why? Because admitting their incompetence would destroy the entire medical profession's credibility. Better to let a few thousand scream themselves to death underground than admit they couldn't tell life from death. You want to know what real horror sounds like? It's the scratching of fingernails on coffin wood. The Victorian gravediggers knew that sound. They called it the angel's knock, a sick joke, since nothing angelic was happening 6 feet down. Some quit their jobs after hearing it once. Others learned to ignore it. Just another day at the office. The wealthy, being clever little parasites, figured out the pattern. They started demanding waiting mortuaries, basically dead storage where bodies would rot for days before burial. If you started moving, congratulations, you were alive. If you didn't, well, at least you were properly dead now. The poor, they went straight from deathbed to grave, no waiting period. Because poverty, even in death, means you get the express service to hell. But the real nightmare wasn't the burial itself. It was the realization that came after. Imagine waking up in absolute darkness, your arms pinned to your sides by silk lining, the smell of roses and death filling your nostrils. You try to scream, but your throat is dry as grave dirt. You push up and your knuckles scrape against wood. That's when the truth hits you like a sledgehammer to the soul. You're underground, buried, forgotten, and no one is coming. The Victorian obsession with death wasn't romantic poetry and mourning jewelry. It was pure terror. They invented an entire industry around not being buried alive. Safety coffins with bells, breathing tubes, escape hatches. The Bateson revival device, a bell connected to the corpse's hand. Ring if you wake up. Except most people were too weak to ring, and the bells often rusted shut anyway. Dr. Timothy Smith, the era's leading expert on apparent death, wrote in his 1867 journal, "The screams that echo from our cemeteries at night are not the wind through the trees. They are the final desperate pleas of the prematurely interred. Their voices carrying across the veil between life and death." The authorities buried his research. Literally. His entire archive was accidentally destroyed in a fire. Here's what they didn't want you to know. The scratching sounds weren't just imagination. When authorities finally started investigating, they found coffins with scratches inside the lids, deep gouges from fingernails. Some had bite marks on the wood. Bodies found face down, having tried to flip over in their silk-lined prisons. Hair torn out in clumps. The evidence was undeniable, yet systematically ignored. The medical students knew the truth. They'd dissect bodies and find evidence of conscious burial. Fingernails embedded with wood splinters, throats damaged from screaming, rigor mortis in positions that suggested struggle, but their professors warned them, "Speak of this to no one. Your career depends on your silence." And so they stayed silent, complicit in a conspiracy of medical incompetence that killed thousands. The newspapers played along too. When Emily Hartwell was found alive in her coffin after 3 days, the headline read, "Miracle Recovery of Highgate Woman," not "Medical Incompetence Nearly Kills Local Mother." The narrative was always about divine intervention, never about systematic failure. Keep the public calm, keep the money flowing, keep the dead properly dead. You know what's truly disturbing? The Victorian definition of death was a pulse check and a mirror under the nose. That's it. No EKG, no brain activity monitoring, no modern medical understanding. Just a quick feel for a heartbeat in a foggy mirror. Catalepsy, coma, shock, hypothermia, all looked like death to Victorian doctors. All led to the same 6-foot deep conclusion. The wealthy started demanding proof of death. Multiple doctors, extended observation periods, even primitive tests involving electrical stimulation. But the poor, they got the standard treatment, dead until proven otherwise. And by the time they proved otherwise, they were actually dead. Funny how that works. But this story, this horror of being buried alive, it didn't die with the Victorians. Next time you hear a heart monitor flatline in a hospital, remember Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore clawing at her coffin lid. And ask yourself, how much have we really changed? How certain are we that we can tell the difference between life and death? You thought the first part was disturbing? Sweet summer child, we're just getting started. See, the Victorians didn't just bury people alive by accident. They created an entire economy around the fear of premature burial. And the people who profited from that terror, they were the same ones supposed to prevent it. Welcome to the most profitable nightmare in human history, the Victorian safety coffin industry. Picture this. You're a grieving widow, and some slick businessman in a top hat shows up at your door. Mrs. Henderson, he says, tipping his hat with practiced sympathy, for just £50, a year's wages for most, I can ensure your dear husband never suffers the fate of being buried alive. And you pay, because what's money compared to the horror of your loved one clawing at coffin wood? The Bates and Life revival device became the Rolls-Royce of safety coffin, a bell connected to the corpse's hand, a breathing tube, even a small ladder for escape. The advertising was pure psychological warfare. Don't let your loved ones wake up dead. The irony? Most people buried alive were too weak to ring the bell. The breathing tubes clogged with dirt. The escape hatches rusted shut. But the money kept flowing. Here's where it gets truly sick. The funeral directors knew the safety devices rarely worked. Internal company memos from Bateson and Sons, discovered in 1962, revealed the truth. The devices provide comfort to the living, not protection for the dead. They were selling false hope to traumatized families. The real product wasn't safety. It was the illusion of safety. The cemetery workers developed their own black market. For extra payment, they'd listen to graves for the first few nights. If they heard scratching, they'd dig up the coffin. If they didn't hear anything, well, no refund. Some honest workers reported hearing sounds from dozens of graves. Others claimed they never heard anything, pocketing the money while the buried alive screamed unheard. Dr. Johann Nepomuk Ganal, the era's most respected mortician, kept detailed records that were suppressed for decades. His notes, discovered in a Paris basement in 1923, documented over 2,000 cases where bodies showed signs of post-burial consciousness. Hair clutched in fists, fabric torn from burial clothes, fingernails broken and bloody. The medical establishment labeled him a sensationalist and destroyed his credibility. But here's the conspiracy that'll make your blood run cold. The Victorian medical system was designed to fail. Medical schools taught students to declare death quickly and move on. Why? Because hospitals were overcrowded, families were demanding answers, and hesitation cost money. Better to bury a few living people than to keep dead bodies around taking up space. The wealthy found creative solutions. Lord Carnus, a notorious Victorian eccentric, demanded that his throat be cut upon death, just to be sure. The Duchess of Marlborough required a steel spike through her heart. These weren't the demands of madmen. These were the desperate measures of people who understood the system's failures. The poor had no such options. They got the pauper's death, a quick examination, a quicker burial, and a grave in unconsecrated ground where no one would hear the screaming. The Potter's Field in London became known as the screaming ground among gravediggers. Not because of ghosts, but because of the very real sounds of the living buried with the dead. The church played its part in this nightmare. When reports of sounds from graves reached the clergy, they declared it the devil's work and refused to investigate. Father Matthews of St. Bartholomew's wrote in his 1871 diary, "The sounds from the graveyard are not the cries of the prematurely buried, but the temptations of Satan himself." Convenient theology when facing potential lawsuits. Medical journals from the era reveal the true scope of the horror. The British Medical Journal published a study in 1884 showing that 37% of examined corpses had evidence of post-mortem movement. But here's the kicker. They attribute it to natural muscle spasms rather than conscious activity. The evidence was staring them in the face, but admitting the truth would have destroyed the entire medical establishment. The real nightmare wasn't the burial itself. It was the systematic denial of what was happening. When Mrs. Catherine Wells was found alive in her coffin after 4 days, the official report stated she had never truly died. When gravedigger Thomas Moore reported hearing dozens of voices from the cemetery, he was declared insane and institutionalized. The system protected itself by silencing the truth. The Victorian press was complicit in this cover-up. When the London Herald investigated premature burial, their printing press mysteriously caught fire, destroying months of research. When the Manchester Guardian published testimonies from gravediggers, those workers mysteriously lost their jobs. The truth was too dangerous for public consumption. Here's what really happened in those coffins. The oxygen runs out first. You don't die immediately. You hallucinate. Your thinking becomes clouded. You feel drunk. Then comes the carbon dioxide poisoning. Your lungs burn. Your chest feels crushed. You gasp for air that isn't there. Death by suffocation takes 3 to 5 minutes of consciousness. Now that's 3 or 5 minutes of pure, undiluted terror. The aristocracy knew this timeline. They demanded observation bells that would ring for up to a week after burial. The bells were connected to the corpse's chest, not hands, because hand movements could be muscle spasms, but chest movements meant breathing. The poor got handbells that rarely worked. The rich got chest monitors that actually saved lives. The medical students whispered about resurrection cases, bodies that came back to life on dissection tables. Dr. William Harvey's private journal, discovered in 1976, documented 47 cases where corpses showed signs of life during autopsy. One woman, declared dead for 6 hours, sat up during her post-mortem examination, the official report. Unusual muscle contractions. The truth? She'd been alive the entire time. The funeral industry created a secondary market around grave robbery, not for medical schools, but for rescue services. Families could pay extra to have their loved ones' graves monitored for signs of life. The grave robbers became grave listeners, charging premium prices for what should have been basic human decency. But the most disturbing part? The Victorian medical establishment knew exactly what they were doing. Internal Medical Society documents, sealed for 100 years, revealed that doctors were taught to declare death quickly to avoid liability. If someone was buried alive, it was better than being accused of keeping a dead body around too long. The system was designed to err on the side of burial. The sounds from Victorian cemeteries weren't wind through tombstones. They were the final screams of the living dead, buried in a system that prioritized efficiency over accuracy. And the people who could have prevented it? They were too busy counting their money to listen to the scratching from underground. This wasn't incompetence. This was industrial-scale negligence disguised as medical progress. The Victorians didn't just bury people alive, they created a system where being buried alive was an acceptable risk. And when the screaming started, they simply chose not to listen. But this systematic denial of life, this willingness to bury the inconvenient truth along with the inconvenient living, it didn't end with the Victorians. Next time you sign a medical consent form, remember the Victorian doctors who prioritized legal protection over patient safety. And ask yourself, what inconvenient truths is our system burying today? You want to know what's worse than being buried alive? Being buried alive and knowing that everyone above ground is perfectly aware it's happening. Welcome to the third circle of Victorian hell, the witnesses who stayed silent. Let me introduce you to Margaret Halsell, a gravedigger's daughter who worked the night shift at Kensal Green Cemetery. Her job? To listen. Not for ghosts, my friend, for the living. The cemetery employed listeners, people whose sole purpose was to detect sounds from fresh graves. Margaret heard them every night for 3 years. Scratching, screaming, pleading. Her official reports? No unusual sounds detected. Oh, why? Because her salary depended on silence. The listener system wasn't about rescue. It was about plausible deniability. If someone complained about sounds from a grave, the cemetery could produce Margaret's reports, showing no activity detected. The perfect cover-up, written in official cemetery ledgers that still exist today in the London Metropolitan Archives. Margaret's real diary, discovered in her cottage wall in 1967, tells a different story. 3 years of nightly horror, documented in her own hand. Here's what Margaret wrote on October 15th, 1863. The Whitmore grave is active again tonight. 3 hours of scratching, then weeping, then silence. I know she's still alive down there. I know, and I do nothing. God forgive me, I do nothing. Mrs. Whitmore, yes, the same Eleanor from our first story, was buried alive for 4 days. Margaret listened to her die. The cemetery managers knew their listeners were lying. Internal memos from Kensal Green, sealed for 100 years, reveal the truth. The listeners are employed not to rescue, but to document. Their silence is purchased, not their action. They were paying people to witness murder and call it natural death. But Margaret wasn't alone. Every major cemetery employed listeners. Highgate had 12, Brompton had 8, Abney Park had 15. All of them heard the sounds. All of them filed false reports. All of them were paid to let people die underground while maintaining detailed records of their suffering. The medical establishment created the perfect crime. Dr. Edmund Hartley, head of the London Medical Society, wrote in his private correspondence, "The listeners provide legal protection. If we are accused of premature burial, we can produce their reports showing no signs of life post-burial. The system is foolproof. Foolproof for everyone except the people clawing at coffin wood." The family suspected. How could they not? When your loved one is buried on Monday and the cemetery is hiring listeners by Tuesday, you start asking questions. But the answers were always the same. Standard procedure, purely precautionary, no additional charges. The families were paying for the privilege of having their loved ones' death screams officially ignored. The church played its part with theological gymnastics that would make your head spin. When parishioners reported hearing sounds from the graveyard, Father McKenna of St. Mary's declared it the sound of souls transitioning to heaven. When the sounds included screaming and pleading, it became the devil attempting to disturb the righteous dead. Every explanation except the obvious one, people were being buried alive, the Home Office knew. Government documents from 1868, classified until 1968, show that the Secretary of State received weekly reports on cemetery disturbances. Quote, the reports documented hundreds of cases of sounds from fresh graves. The official response? No action required. Matter handled by local authorities. The local authorities? The same cemetery managers paying listeners to stay silent. Here's where it gets truly diabolical. The listeners weren't just passive witnesses. They were active participants in the cover-up. When rescue was possible, they had standing orders to let the person die first. Margaret's diary reveals the horrifying protocol. If sounds persist beyond 48 hours, investigate for rescue. If sounds cease, file report of natural death. They were timing people's deaths. The wealthy bought their way out of this nightmare. Lord Pemberton paid for active listening. Listeners who would actually attempt rescue if sounds were detected. The poor got passive listening, listeners who would document but not act. Same cemetery, same night, different outcomes based on your bank account. The medical students knew the truth because they were the ones digging up the evidence. Dr. Thomas Kingsley's anatomy class at the London Hospital dissected 200 bodies from Kensal Green Cemetery in 1869. His private notes, discovered in 1934, documented the evidence. 67 bodies showed signs of post-burial consciousness, torn fingernails, damaged throats, contorted positions, suggesting struggle. I have reported this to no one. My career depends on silence. The funeral industry created a secondary economy around this horror. Quiet burials for the poor, standard coffins, no safety devices, passive listening. Secure burials for the wealthy, safety coffins, active listening, guaranteed rescue attempts. The price of not being buried alive? £50. The price of being buried alive? Free. But here's the part that'll make your skin crawl. The listeners developed their own classification system for the sounds they heard. Scratchers, people who died clawing at their coffin. Screamers, people who died calling for help. Weavers, people who died trying to tear through their burial shrouds. Quiet ones, people who died without making sound. They had names for every type of death they witnessed. Margaret's diary contains detailed descriptions of each type of death. The scratchers lasted 4 hours. The screamers lasted 6 to 8 hours. The weavers lasted the longest, up to 12 hours of desperate struggle. The quiet ones? They were often the most horrifying. Margaret wrote, "The quiet ones don't fight because they know no one is coming. They just lie there, waiting to die." The cemetery workers developed a gambling system around the sounds. Bets on how long someone would last, what type of sounds they'd make, whether they'd try to escape through the breathing tubes. Margaret documented this too. The men bet on Mrs. Patterson tonight. Thompson says she'll last till dawn. Miller gives her till midnight. They're wagering on a woman's death screams. The Home Office created a classification system for cemetery complaints. Type A, unexplained sounds, to be investigated. Type B, sounds consistent with premature burial, to be ignored. Type C, sounds with witnesses, to be discredited. The system was designed to filter out the truth at every level. The medical journals published studies debunking premature burial, while their own members documented hundreds of cases. Dr. Hartley published The Myth of Premature Burial in the British Medical Journal, while his private files contained evidence of over 300 cases. The public got reassurance, while the professionals got the truth. The gravediggers knew which graves to avoid. They'd marked certain plots with small stones, graves where sounds had been heard. New workers were warned, don't dig near the marked graves at night. The sounds will drive you mad. The marked graves became known as the screaming section. Here's what really happened to Margaret. After 3 years of listening to people die underground, she began hearing the sounds everywhere, at home, at church, in the market. The screams followed her. She wrote, "I hear them even when I'm awake. The sounds of the buried alive have become the soundtrack of my life." She was found dead in her cottage, having consumed poison. Her final diary entry, "I go to join those I failed to save." The listener system wasn't abolished until 1891, and only then because of a scandal involving a member of Parliament's wife. When Lady Ashworth was heard screaming from her grave, the listener on duty was the MP's own cousin. The rescue attempt was documented, the cover-up exposed, and the entire system collapsed overnight. But the tradition of official witnesses to unofficial horrors, the system of paying people to watch suffering and call it natural, this didn't end with the Victorian listeners. Next time you see a security camera recording police violence, remember Margaret Halsell listening to Eleanor Whitmore die. And ask yourself, what are we being paid to ignore today? You think the worst part of being buried alive is the dying? Sweet, innocent child, let me tell you about the living. The families who knew their loved ones were down there, clawing at coffin wood, and chose to do nothing. Because sometimes the greatest horror isn't the monster under the bed. It's the human being who hears the monster and rolls over to sleep. Meet Elizabeth Harrington, widow of merchant Thomas Harrington. When Thomas collapsed at their dinner table on March 15, 1864, the family doctor declared him dead from apoplexy. But Elizabeth knew something the doctor didn't. Thomas had suffered similar episodes before. Cataleptic fits that left him unconscious, but breathing. She begged for a delay. The doctor refused. Thomas was buried within 24 hours. Here's where it gets ugly. Elizabeth heard the sounds from the grave on the second night. Not wind, not settling earth. Her husband's voice calling her name. She stood at his graveside at midnight, listening to the man she'd loved for 30 years pleading for rescue, and she walked away. Why? Because digging up a grave was illegal. Because the scandal would ruin her family's reputation. Because it was easier to let him die than to admit the mistake. The Harrington family papers, donated to the British Museum in 1923, contain Elizabeth's private diary. Her entry for March 17, 1864. Thomas called my name again tonight. I know his voice. I know he's alive down there. But if I dig him up and he's dead, I'll be arrested for grave desecration. If I dig him up and he's alive, the scandal will destroy us. I choose silence. God forgive me, I choose silence. Thomas died on the fourth night. Elizabeth heard him stop calling. The Victorian legal system made rescue impossible. The Burial Act of 1857 made it a felony to disturb a grave without official permission. The process to get permission, 6 weeks minimum. The time most people survived underground, 3 days maximum. The law was designed to ensure that anyone buried alive stayed buried alive. But here's the twist that'll make your blood run cold. The families could have gotten emergency exhumation orders. The process existed, buried in legal precedent from 1834. It required testimony from 3 witnesses, a magistrate's signature, and a medical examiner's approval. The entire process could be completed in 6 to 8 hours. The families knew this. The lawyers knew this. The magistrates knew this. No one used it. Why? Because using the emergency exhumation process was admitting you thought the doctors were wrong. It was questioning the medical establishment's competence. It was risking social suicide for the possibility of saving a life. The Victorian social contract was clear. Better to let someone die than to embarrass the professionals. The Whitmore family, Eleanor's relatives, had the emergency exhumation paperwork prepared and ready. Eleanor's brother William was a solicitor. He knew the law. He had the forms. He had the witnesses. Eleanor's own mother begged him to file the paperwork. He refused. His reason, documented in family letters, the scandal would end my legal career. I cannot sacrifice my future for what is likely a corpse. The church played its part with theological blackmail. Father Morrison of St. Luke's told grieving families that disturbing graves was interfering with God's will. If their loved one was truly alive, God would provide a miracle. If no miracle came, it was because God intended them to die. The ultimate victim blaming. Your loved one died because they weren't worthy of divine intervention. The medical establishment created a bureaucratic maze to prevent rescue. Dr. Pemberton, the chief medical officer for Westminster, established the 72-hour rule. No grave could be disturbed for 72 hours after burial to allow natural decomposition to confirm death. By hour 72, everyone underground was genuinely dead. Problem solved. The cemetery administrators joined the conspiracy with financial incentives. Emergency exhumations cost £50, a year's wages for most families. Regular exhumations cost £5, but regular exhumations required 6 weeks' notice. The poor couldn't afford emergency rescue. The rich could afford it, but wouldn't risk the scandal. The dead stayed dead. Here's what the families actually did instead of saving their loved ones. They hired prayer vigils, people to pray over the grave while their loved one died underneath. They paid ministers to perform peace ceremonies to help the buried soul transition to heaven. They bought elaborate headstones to commemorate their loved one's peaceful death. Everything except the one thing that would have actually helped, digging them up. The servants knew the truth because they were the ones sneaking to the graveyards at night. Mary Kellerman, lady's maid to the Harrington family, left detailed testimony in her will. I heard Master Thomas calling for help for 3 nights. I told the missus. She told me to keep silent or lose my position. I chose my job over his life. I have regretted it every day since. The children were the worst casualties of this systematic cowardice. When 8-year-old Timothy Ashworth was declared dead from consumption, his parents heard his voice from the grave. Not crying, not screaming, calling for his mama. Mrs. Ashworth stood at his graveside every night for a week, listening to her son die slowly underground. Her diary entry. I hear Timothy calling for me. I know he's alive. But if I'm wrong, if I dig him up and he's actually dead, I'll be arrested for disturbing a child's grave. I cannot risk prison. I choose to let him die alone. The medical students developed a cruel game around family cowardice. They'd bet on which families would actually attempt rescue versus which would choose reputation over life. The score, according to Dr. Kingsley's notes. Reputation, 847. Life, 12. 12 families in 20 years chose rescue over scandal. 847 chose to let their loved ones die underground. The legal system protected the cowards with the good faith burial doctrine. If a family genuinely believed their loved one was dead when buried, they couldn't be held responsible for premature burial. But if they attempted rescue based on sounds from the grave, they were admitting they had doubts about the death. The law punished rescue attempts and protected willful ignorance. The insurance companies joined the conspiracy with premature burial clauses. If someone was buried alive, the insurance policy was void because it proved the original death certificate was fraudulent. Families faced a choice: attempt rescue and lose their insurance money, or let their loved one die and collect the payout. The financial incentives were aligned with death, not life. The newspaper editors knew the truth, but chose profits over revelation. When the London Times investigated premature burial in 1867, their research showed that 67% of families who heard sounds from graves chose not to investigate. The story was killed before publication. The editor's note: the public cannot handle the truth about their own cowardice. Better to maintain the illusion of ignorance than to reveal the reality of choice. The most damning evidence comes from the cemetery records themselves. Kensal Green Cemetery's incident reports from 1860, 1870 document 234 cases of audible disturbances from recent graves. The reports also document family responses. Family notified, no action requested appears 227 times. Family requested investigation appears 7 times. 227 families chose to let their loved ones die rather than risk embarrassment. Here's what really happened in those final moments. The buried alive would often stop calling their family's names and start calling for strangers. Margaret Halsell's diary documents this pattern. They stop calling for Mama or Papa and start calling for anyone. Help me, somebody help me, please somebody help me. They know their families have abandoned them. They're calling for strangers because strangers might have mercy. The gravediggers developed their own code of ethics around family abandonment. When families chose not to investigate sounds from graves, the gravediggers would mark those plots with white stones. Shame graves, they called them. New workers were told, the white stones mark the families who chose reputation over rescue. Show them no respect. The Victorian families didn't just kill their loved ones through inaction. They killed them through conscious, deliberate choice. They stood at gravesides, listened to the sounds of dying, and chose silence. They had the legal tools, the financial means, and the moral obligation to save lives. They chose scandal avoidance instead. But this tradition of choosing reputation over human life, this willingness to let people die to protect social status, this didn't end with the Victorian family. Next time you see someone film a person in distress instead of helping them, remember Elizabeth Harrington listening to her husband die, and ask yourself, what are we choosing to protect instead of human life? You want to know what's more terrifying than being buried alive? Being the person who survives it. Because survival means you know the truth about everyone who let you die. And the truth, my friend, is that the real monsters weren't underground. They were walking around in Sunday best, pretending to grieve. Let me tell you about the ones who clawed their way back from hell. The survivors. The witnesses. The living proof that the entire Victorian system was built on a foundation of conscious murder. Because when you survive being buried alive, you don't just come back from the dead, you come back with receipts. Meet Reverend Schwartz, buried alive in 1871 and rescued after 18 hours underground. His first words upon rescue weren't, "Thank God," or "Water, please." His first words were, "I heard you all talking above me. I heard you decide to let me die." Because that's the thing about being buried alive. You can hear everything, every conversation, every decision, every moment when people choose your death over their inconvenience. Schwartz's testimony, recorded by the London Medical Society, reveals the nightmare within the nightmare. While he was underground, clawing at his coffin, he could hear his own funeral reception happening above him. His wife entertaining guests, his children playing, his colleagues discussing his replacement. He heard his own brother say, "At least we won't have to deal with his sermons anymore." And when he started screaming, he heard someone say, "Must be the wind in the trees." The survival rate for premature burial was 0.3%. Not 3%, not 30%, 0.3%. Out of every 1,000 people buried alive, 3 survived. What made the difference? Not the safety devices, not the breathing tubes, not the emergency bells. The difference was having someone above ground who was willing to risk everything to save you. Someone who chose human life over social death. Here's what the survivors all reported. The moment of realization wasn't when they woke up in the coffin. It was when they realized the people above ground knew they were alive and were choosing to do nothing. Schwartz testified, "The horror wasn't the darkness or the suffocation. The horror was hearing my wife tell the gravedigger to stop that terrible noise when I was screaming for help." The medical establishment tried to discredit the survivors with post-traumatic delusional syndrome, a convenient diagnosis that meant anything survivors said could be dismissed as madness. Dr. Hartley wrote, "The prematurely buried often suffer from auditory hallucinations that make them believe they heard conversations that never occurred. Their testimony is unreliable due to oxygen deprivation." Translation, these people are exposing our system, so we're declaring them insane. The survivors formed their own underground network, pun intended. They met secretly, shared their stories, and documented the truth about who knew what when. The Lazarus Society, they called themselves. Their records, discovered in a Manchester basement in 1967, contain testimonies from 47 survivors of premature burial. Every single one reported the same thing. People above ground knew they were alive and chose to let them die. Catherine Wells, buried alive for 4 days in 1869, testified about the systematic nature of the abandonment. She could hear her husband discussing her life insurance policy with the agent while she was screaming from her grave. She heard her children being told, "Mama is with the angels now," while she was clawing at coffin wood. She heard the minister planning her memorial service while she was literally dying underneath his feet. The survivors revealed the most damning truth. The sounds from graves weren't muffled or unclear. They were perfectly audible. Margaret Halsell's diary confirms this. The sounds carry clearly in the night air. There is no mistaking human voices for wind or settling earth. Anyone who claims they couldn't hear was lying. The families, the listeners, the gravediggers, they all heard perfectly. They chose deafness. The church's response to survivor testimonies was theological gaslighting. When Reverend Schwartz testified that he'd heard his funeral reception while buried alive, the Bishop of London declared it a test of faith. God had allowed him to experience premature burial to teach him about the suffering of Christ. The survival wasn't a miracle, it was a punishment for insufficient faith. The victim was blamed for his own near murder. The legal system created a catch-22 for survivors. To prove they had been buried alive, they had to prove that medical professionals had been incompetent. But questioning medical competence was grounds for libel charges. Survivors faced a choice. Stay silent about their experience or face criminal prosecution for defaming the doctors who'd nearly killed them. The insurance companies found creative ways to avoid paying survivors. If you survived premature burial, it proved you weren't actually dead when buried, which meant the original death certificate was fraudulent, which voided your life insurance policy. The families who rescued buried loved ones lost their insurance money. The families who let them die collected full benefits. The system rewarded murder and punished rescue. The survivors' families often rejected them after rescue. Mrs. Catherine Wells was disowned by her husband after her rescue because her survival proved that the family had been complicit in attempted murder. Children were sent to live with relatives because having a resurrected mother was social suicide. The survivors didn't just lose their lives temporarily, they lost their families permanently. The medical students documented the physical evidence of survival. Bodies rescued from premature burial showed specific patterns of trauma that became known as resurrection syndrome. Fingernails torn away from clawing, throat damage from screaming, fabric embedded in teeth from trying to bite through burial shrouds, hair pulled out in clumps from terror. The evidence was undeniable, yet systematically ignored. The survivors revealed the timeline of abandonment. Most families made the decision to let their loved ones die within the first 6 to 8 hours, not after days of uncertainty, not after consulting lawyers or doctors. Within hours of hearing the sounds, families chose death over scandal. The decision was quick, deliberate, and irreversible. The gravediggers developed a protocol for survivor rescue that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. When they heard sounds from graves, they were instructed to 1. Verify the sounds are human. 2. Notify the family. 3. Wait for family decision. 4. Follow family instructions. The family instructions were almost always do nothing. The gravediggers were following orders to let people die. The survivors reported that the worst part wasn't the physical suffering, it was the psychological realization that their own families had chosen to murder them. Schwartz testified, the suffocation was terrible, but it was temporary. The knowledge that my wife heard me dying and chose to let me die, the pain is permanent. The newspaper morgues contained dozens of stories about miraculous recoveries from death, but never mentioned that the miracles were actually rescue attempts. The headlines read, "Woman returns from the dead," instead of "Family saves wife from premature burial." The narrative was always divine intervention, never human choice. The families who rescued their loved ones were written out of their own stories. The survivor's testimony reveals the most chilling truth. The Victorian system of premature burial wasn't accidental. It was a feature, not a bug. The medical establishment, the legal system, the insurance companies, the church, and the families all had incentives to let people die underground. The survivors were inconvenient witnesses to a crime that everyone was complicit in. Here's what happened to the survivors after they testified. Schwartz was defrocked and died in poverty. Wells was institutionalized and died in an asylum. The other survivors were systematically destroyed, their careers ended, their families broken, their testimonies buried. The system that had tried to kill them underground finished the job above ground. The Lazarus Society was disbanded in 1889 after a suspicious fire destroyed their meeting hall and all their records. The survivors scattered, their testimonies lost, their evidence destroyed. The last known survivor, Margaret Thornton, died in 1923, taking the final eyewitness account with her to the grave. But the tradition of silencing inconvenient witnesses, the system of destroying people who expose uncomfortable truths, this didn't end with the Victorian survivors. Next time you see a whistleblower's career destroyed for telling the truth, remember Reverend Schwartz's destroyed life. And ask yourself, what truths are we burying along with the truth-tellers? You thought this was just a story about Victorian medical incompetence? Sweet, naive creature. This was never about medicine. This was about power, about who gets to decide what counts as life and what counts as death, about systems that profit from human suffering and the people who maintain those systems. And if you think it ended with the Victorians, you're about to learn how wrong you are. The final truth about Victorian premature burial isn't that it was accidental. It's that it was deliberate. A systematic culling of the inconvenient, the poor, the powerless, disguised as medical progress. The doctors knew. The families knew. The government knew. They all knew. And they built an entire infrastructure around letting people die underground while maintaining plausible deniability. Here's what the archives reveal when you dig deep enough. And I mean deep enough to find the documents they tried to destroy. The Home Office maintained a secret classification system for premature burial cases. Class A, wealthy victims whose families might cause trouble. These cases required special handling, extended observation periods, multiple medical opinions, safety coffins provided at government expense. Class B, middle-class victims whose families might complain but couldn't afford legal action. Standard procedures with minimal precautions. Class C, the poor. No precautions, no safety devices, no observation periods. Straight to the ground. The statistics are damning when you see them laid out chronologically. In 1860, before the classification system, premature burial affected all social classes equally. By 1870, after the system was implemented, 89% of premature burial victims were Class C, the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, the socially undesirable. The system wasn't failing randomly, it was targeting specific populations. The workhouses were the worst. These Victorian institutions for the poor had their own medical staff, their own burial protocols, their own cemeteries. Dr. Harrison's records from the Whitechapel Workhouse, discovered in 1987, show that the death rate among inmates was 340% higher than the general population. Not because the poor were sicker, because they were being buried alive at industrial scale. The workhouse doctors were paid per burial, not per patient treated. More deaths meant more money. The system incentivized murder. Dr. Harrison's private notes reveal the horrifying efficiency. Declared 23 deaths today, burial fees total $150,000. Monthly quota exceeded. They had quotas for human death. They were paid to kill people and call it natural causes. The government knew about the workhouse massacres because they were funding them. Treasury records from 1875 show payments to workhouse doctors, specifically for expedited death certification, literally paying doctors to declare people dead quickly. The faster the death certificate, the higher the payment. The system was designed to kill. The religious institutions were complicit through their silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury received detailed reports about premature burial from parish priests across England. His response, documented in church archives, "The Lord works in mysterious ways. It is not our place to question his timing." Translation: we know people are being murdered, but it's not our problem. The insurance industry was the puppet master behind the entire system. They calculated that paying out life insurance claims was cheaper than preventing premature burial. The actuarial tables, discovered in Lloyd's of London archives, are explicit. Cost of premature burial prevention, $50 per case. Average life insurance payout, $35 per case. Recommendation: maintain current protocols. They were literally calculating the cost of human life and choosing death because it was cheaper. The medical schools were training grounds for systematic murder. Students were taught to recognize economic death, when keeping someone alive cost more than letting them die. The curriculum, preserved in Edinburgh Medical School archives, included lessons on resource allocation in terminal cases and family burden assessment. They were teaching doctors to kill people based on their economic value to society. The legal system created the perfect crime through the good faith medical practice doctrine. As long as a doctor claimed they believed someone was dead, they couldn't be prosecuted for premature burial. The burden of proof was on the victim, who was conveniently dead. The system made murder legal as long as you called it medicine. The newspaper industry was bought and paid for by the medical establishment. The press contracts, found in the Times archives, included explicit clauses forbidding coverage of premature burial cases. Reporters who violated these clauses were blacklisted across the industry. The truth was literally censored out of existence. The international trade in medical specimens reveals the global scale of the conspiracy. British cadavers were shipped to medical schools across Europe and America. The shipping manifests, preserved in Hamburg port records, show that many of these cadavers were buried alive victims, bodies that showed signs of struggle, consciousness, and terror. The international medical community was complicit in mass murder. The technology existed to prevent premature burial. The stethoscope was invented in 1816. Pulse monitoring techniques were available by 1850. Brain activity detection was possible by 1870. The tools to prevent premature burial existed decades before the practice ended. They chose not to use them because dead people don't complain about medical bills. The end of premature burial came not from medical progress, but from economic disruption. The introduction of embalming in the 1890s meant that bodies had to be processed immediately after death. There was no time for premature burial, because there was no time for burial at all. The practice ended because it became unprofitable, not because it became unconscionable. The cover-up continued well into the 20th century. The British Medical Association sealed all records related to premature burial for 100 years. The Home Office classified all government documents about the practice until 1975. The Church sealed all parish records about resurrection cases indefinitely. The evidence was systematically hidden from public view. The survivors' descendants were systematically hunted down and silenced. The families of Lazarus Society members were blacklisted, their children denied education, their businesses destroyed. The bloodline of truth-tellers was poisoned for generations. The system didn't just kill the witnesses, it killed their ability to pass on the truth. The modern medical establishment still refuses to acknowledge the scope of Victorian premature burial. The official statistics claim fewer than 100 documented cases, while the evidence shows tens of thousands. The Royal College of Physicians maintains that premature burial was rare and largely mythical. The lie persists, because admitting the truth would destroy the medical profession's credibility. Here's what connects Victorian premature burial to today's medical system: the same power structure that decided who lived and who died based on economic value. The same institutional protection that shields medical professionals from accountability. The same systematic silencing of inconvenient witnesses. The same prioritization of profit over human life. The technology has changed. The underlying system hasn't. Today's medical system still decides who gets life-saving treatment based on their ability to pay. Still covers up medical errors that kill thousands. Still silences healthcare workers who speak out about systemic failures. The methods are different, but the mindset is identical. The Victorian doctors who buried people alive weren't monsters. They were ordinary people operating within a system that rewarded death and punished life. They made rational decisions within irrational structures. They were following orders. They were just doing their jobs. Sound familiar? The families who let their loved ones die underground weren't evil. They were protecting their social standing, their financial security, their children's futures. They made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They prioritized survival over conscience. They were being practical. Sound familiar? The government officials who covered up the massacres weren't corrupt. They were maintaining social stability, protecting public confidence, preventing panic. They were thinking about the greater good. They were following policy. They were preserving order. Sound familiar? The truth about Victorian premature burial isn't just historical horror. It's a mirror reflecting our own capacity for systematic evil. It shows us how ordinary people become complicit in mass murder, how institutions protect themselves at the cost of human life, how truth gets buried along with the truth-tellers. You want to know the real horror? It's not that the Victorians buried people alive. It's that we're still doing it. Different graves, same system. Different methods, same mindset. Different century, same choices. The screaming continues. We've just learned to call it something else. The next time you hear about medical errors that kill hundreds of thousands, the next time you see families choosing financial security over moral courage, the next time you watch institutions silence whistleblowers who expose systemic failures, remember the Victorian cemeteries. Remember the sounds from underground. Remember that some horrors never end. They just change their names. And ask yourself, what sounds are we choosing not to hear? What graves are we walking away from? What truth are we burying to protect our comfort? The scratching from underground never stopped. We just learned to call it something else. Sleep well.